I want to give you an example of symbolic interpretation and how symbolic interpretation is far superior than sometimes what we call literal descriptions or historically accurate descriptions. And this is actually a little bit of a pet peeve of mine, so I'll have to hold back not to fall into rant mode. This is Jonathan Pageau. Welcome to the Symbolic World. For example, in the movie The Passion, which I really like, actually, I think in terms of narrative, it's a very powerful, it's one of the best narratively driven stories of Christ that I've ever seen. But there's this annoying detail in the movie, and it's one that comes from this kind of desire to be historically accurate. And it is the idea that Christ is nailed to the cross through his wrists. And this has kind of infected Christian thinking. You see it in now representation, sometimes in paintings and statues. You'll see Christ with the nail going through his wrist. Now, from the very beginning of Christianity, in every representation of the crucifixion, we show the nail that is being planted through Christ's hands. And this has been the tradition all along. And then sometime in the 1950s, some doctor, actually doctor said, well, you couldn't have the nails go through the hands because, if you put the nail through the hands, then, the nail would rip through the hand, because it's too fragile. But if you put the nail through the wrist, then, the bones here on the wrist would hold the nail together. And therefore it would make more sense, logically and medically that Jesus would have been nailed through his wrist. And so people go, oh, because the word for hand, that's used in the Bible is a word that's general, that could mean hand, could mean forearm, could mean wrist, and the Christians, of course, showed that the nail went through the hands. And so you could say, well, then it's plausible that, that this is what would have been done because you put the nail through the wrist of the crucified one. And, this is really where you see how modern kind of materialist, mechanical explanations just go completely awry and how people really completely invert the order of meaning in a way that is extremely annoying, because what the person ends up saying is something like this. The word hand means all of this here, right? And so because scientifically and to be historically accurate, it would not be possible for the nail to be put through the hand. Therefore, what that word probably means, what it means when it says that they put a nail through his hand, is that they put the nail through the wrist. And that's what that means. And so now we know, because we're scientists and we're so good at, mechanical causes, now we know that what it means in the Bible, that Christ was crucified through his hands, is that he was crucified through his wrist, because that's how you could hold someone up on a cross. And of course, this is really, if you want to understand an image of the inversion of symbolism, this is it. In truth, it is the very opposite of what it is that meaning, how meaning functions, and what it is that these things are talking about, which is that human beings don't care about their wrists. Human beings care about their hands. Hands are an extension of the human person. After the face, the hand is where the human person exists the most. It's the things you use to make and to hold things, and to hold your friends, and to caress your wife. This is where the human person exists, in the hands. When it talks about, God, using his hands, holding us in his hands, all of these images are related to the fact that the human experience of meaning is through the hands, not through the wrists. The wrists have very little meaning in human experience. Hands have insane amounts of meaning. They hold so much meaning because they are, one of the largest expressions of human action. And it's the same with the feet. And so you could say, well, they couldn't have nailed it through his feet for the same reason. So they nailed it through his, through the top part where the ankle meets with the bone. That's where they would have nailed it so that his feet would hold to the cross. And again, it's the same thing. Your ankle, that part of you has very little meaning in your life, but your feet have a lot of meaning because they take you places. When you want to direct your gaze and you want to go somewhere, your feet are what you feel touching the ground as you move forward. They are like the hands, not as much as the hands, but they are like the hands, the place where humans find meaning and humans experience the world, and so those are the places of meaning. And that is why from the very beginning of Christianity, it was completely normal and completely coherent that his hands were nailed, because his hands are that by which he did things. And therefore to nail them on the cross and to nail them so that they couldn't act anymore, so that they couldn't create, so that they couldn't make, is an image of his pouring out. It is an image of the God who created the cosmos having his hands nailed to the board, having his hands nailed to the wall in an act of complete emptying of himself, into the world, and sacrificing everything that he had and everything that he was. That makes sense. And as a human person, you would understand what it would mean to have pain in your hands, and that your hands be prevented from acting and prevented from doing things. All of that has meaning. Your wrists have very little meaning. And so when you look at the story of the crucifixion, you have to reverse the way that the modern actually thinker talks about it. You would say, is it possible that if I was there in the first century, that this is where the nail would have gone? And the answer is, yeah, maybe. And what does that mean? That means that he nailed him in his hands. The meaning goes the other way. The meaning is that if he's nailed in his wrists, the meaning of it is that he was nailed in his hands. That is the important part. Because you could reduce everything to like millimeters and centimeters. Well, if he nailed it in his hand, did he nail it closer to the wrist or closer to the fingers? How many centimeters from the wrist would you have to nail the nail so that the hand holds? And how many centimeters from the fingers? And then you could find the most precise possible place in the wrist. If you nail it here, is it as solid? Or if you nail it here, how far in the forearm would you have to put the nail so that the person holds on the cross? This is not what it's important. What is important is what it means. And therefore, if the Roman soldier nailed, and maybe, who knows, maybe he nailed it in different places on the different hands because he didn't really care. It doesn't matter. When you make a representation, you represent it in meaning. That is what a representation is for. The reason why you would want to represent something in a movie, the reason why you want to represent something in a painting, the reason why you want to represent it in a book is because it has meaning. And therefore, you have to represent it in meaning. And so if you have a choice between showing a nail going through the wrist and showing a nail going through the hand, you put it in the hand, because that's the reason why you're representing it in the first place, is to signify, is to kind of compress things towards their meaning and not towards the idiosyncrasy of the moment, or to just the kind of, let's say, practical underpinning, mechanical underpinnings of how something happened. And that is, of course, everything about Scripture is like that. That is why there is no attempt, no desire to explain what's mechanically happening during the miracles. And the miracles don't mean the mechanical things. There's no reason to try to explain the mechanical causes of the miracle. At least there's very little reason to it. I mean, I guess you can imagine a moment where it's kind of interesting to think about that, but it's definitely should never become the central question. It should never become the thing that interests you the most. The thing that interests you the most is the meaning, because the meaning is the reason why you represent something, and the meaning is the reason why you remember it. And so this, of course, feeds into all kinds of things, to all kinds of things, and the way in which we remember things and the way in which we represent things. When they move towards meaning, we shouldn't freak out. we shouldn't say, well, to be historically accurate and to be, to be scientifically accurate, we should represent things this way. This is most often a mistake, because if you move towards detail and you move toward idiosyncrasy and you move towards something that is just showing the mechanical cause of something, one of the things you're doing is that you're moving away from the meaning, and of course, there has to be an interplay between the two. There has to be a way in which these things are connected together, because the world manifests itself in meaning. This is not arbitrary. Why you would want to nail someone's hands to the board so that he can't grab onto the soldiers, so that he can't try to free himself, so that he can't try to get off the cross. You can kind of understand why you would do that, but then you also have to understand what it means, and what it means to the people watching, and what it means to the people seeing that this person has been immobilized in his action, right? He's been pinned down by the authority so that he can no longer be free, and he can no longer act on his own. So this was really just a small note, a little a rant that is not very long, but to kind of help you think about symbolism, and to, maybe you can think about other examples where this has happened. I I grew up in a world where this was constantly the case, where, when people trying to think about the crossing of the Red Sea, they're far more interested in figuring out, could there be a wind that could push through and could, open up, there's a part of the Red Sea where the water's not very deep, where it's only, a few, like 1 foot deep. And if there was a really strong wind, then it could separate, and they're trying to figure out, and then they forget why it matters. They forget to think about how the crossing of the Red Sea is related to baptism, how the crossing of the Red Sea is related to the creation of the world, to the end of the flood, to all of these powerful images that help us understand why this is the image that God chose, to reveal to us the transition from an old dying world to a new world. We kind of forget that, and then we end up getting focused on the mechanical details. And so hopefully this will slowly reorient your brain, slowly, let's say, put things in the proper order. But it's something that we forget all the time, that we forget that the reason why we remember and the reason why we represent is for meaning's sake and not for detail's sake. And if we have to remember a detail rather than another, it's always because there's a reason. Because memory is expensive and representation is expensive in terms of action and in terms of things. And sometimes, and if you're representing, you want it to be like a bullseye. You want it to be something like a funnel that leads you towards the reason for that memory and that representation. So I hope this was useful and interesting to you. If you like what we do at the Symbolic World, don't forget to go to thesymbolicworld.com. You can sign up and become a member of the Symbolic World. There are also ways that you can support us financially. And don't forget that all of these episodes of the Symbolic World we put out, they're also out on your favorite podcast platform as well, if you want to just listen to the audio. And so thanks everyone for your attention, and I'll talk to you very soon. Bye-bye. I said I would never do it again, but here we are. We are announcing the Symbolic World Summit in May 2026. I have so many great people around me that I'm just excited to do it, even though I thought it would be crazy to do it again.
Our summit's going to be from May 14th through 16th in Broadview Heights, Ohio. You can buy tickets at symbolicworldsummit.com. We have early bird pricing going right now, $50 off of general admission and VIP tickets. Keynote speakers this year are Father Josiah Trenham and Dr. Mary Harrington, which is a combination nobody knew that they wanted, but I think is going to be absolutely incredible. And of course, Jonathan and I will be speaking, as well as several people from around the Symbolic World community.
A lot of people that you like, that you've seen, are going to be there, are going to come. We're going to have book signings. It'll be a lot of time for people to meet and to greet. We're also doing Supra as well. And so come and join us. We can't wait for this, and we're excited to meet you in person.